You grew up in rural West Virginia, and but raised also in Maryland. I was curious about some of your earliest interactions with bluegrass and what you first remember hearing or seeing when you were growing up.
Well, I kind of grew up with the music all around me. My dad was a banjo player, and my mother was sang like old traditional country ballads, like I don't know, Blue Sky Boys, Bales Brothers, stuff like that. So the music was always around the house when I was a kid, and we had a record collection that contained a lot of traditional country music of the time. This would have been, late 50s, early 60s. But they also had Reno and Smiley records and Stanley Brothers records, and so, I sort of grew up around it.
Yeah.
And but as I became, a young adolescent, I got involved in the music that my peers were listening to. Bob Dylan and John Prine, and also some of the blues-influenced rock bands like Cream and Led Zeppelin, and some of Jimi Hendrix music and things like that. So my taste started to wander into that direction probably until the early 70s, when the disco craze sort of came into being. Because that kind of left me cold. There's nothing wrong with it. I realize that now, but at the time, it seemed kind of phony and overproduced, and that led me back to bluegrass and some of the more. It's interesting. Most of the people that get into bluegrass, as teenagers and things, tended to drift toward the country gentleman and the Seldom Scene and some of the more urban styles. But my taste went to the Stanley Brothers and Bill Monroe and Jimmy Martin and people like that. And I think the reason that it did, and I've tried to self-analyze myself over the years, but I think it was the intensity of that music that really drew me to it, because it wasn't that far a throw from, Hank Williams to Johnny Winter or somebody. You know, I mean, they were both just pouring it on, and that's how I ended up back in the bluegrass world.
Well, I mean, some of those characters, Jimmy Martin and Ralph Stanley, I mean, they were larger than life and they were real.
Yeah, and they were also accessible. Coming from that sort of rock and roll world where, the performer would come out, play his show, and then be whisked away to his hotel in a limousine, these guys were buying hot dogs in the hot dog stand just like I was.
Yeah.
And there's something I found really intriguing about that. And also the community of playing music together with strangers in a parking lot, that also intrigued me. It wasn't just the music that drew me in. It was the whole culture around it.
Yeah. Well, I will say too, to your point, I've been a longtime music journalist, and I love all music just as you do, but I always found the bluegrassers more intriguing because they would actually talk to me. It'd be really hard for me to talk to the top tier rock and rollers because they don't want to do interviews, but there I am, at Bean Blossom, and people are walking around and you can start talking to them, and it's what's so funny is that like you get such great conversations that you almost have to walk away from the conversations.
Well, and I found that to be the case too. And the people that were my early heroes, like I don't know, Ralph Stanley's one, and Del McCurry is another. They're just nice people.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not a lot of ego involved there. They're just very, very approachable.
Yeah, I think it also has to do, too, with a lot of the fact that not only does the music go back to a very rural, simple, and blue-collar background, but a lot of times these guys, still to this day, have full-time gigs outside of this thing,
Right. No, you're right. Well, the Seldom Scene was kind of noted for that in the early days. One guy was a surgeon. One guy was an illustrator for a newspaper. Yeah. One guy was a mathematician. One was a cartographer. I think that's what you call a map maker.
Yeah.
For National Geographic. I mean, they were all employed full time, and it, there's something kind of relaxing about that in a way. they didn't have to go out and play every weekend. They didn't have to get on a bus and go away for 5 or 6 weeks at a time.
Yeah.
And we still sort of operate that way, although, we're kind of getting of the age now that most of us are retiring from our day jobs. But still, there's that attitude that we don't want to go out there and just go crazy on the road, because we've all done that in different groups, So this is more of a weekend warrior type of thing. But one of the nice things about operating like this is that we're really close friends. It's not like we're living on top of each other in a bus or in hotel rooms. And so when we do get together to play, and I mean this in all sincerity, we really look forward to seeing each other. Yeah. And there's a great camaraderie.
I've always been curious, why was D.C. such a hotbed for bluegrass? Part of me thinks obviously it has to do with Southerners going north for work, but why was D.C. such a hotbed? That whole Maryland D.C. scene for bluegrass.
I think there were a couple of factors. First, there were some pretty heavy hitters that moved to D.C. for the exact reason that you just explained, that they were looking for factory work, and because there was employment was tough, in the rural Appalachian areas. But if you think about some of the early people that played bluegrass around Washington, D.C., were, the Country Gentlemen, and probably, way before him was Buzz Busby and the Bayou Boys. Yeah. They had a weekly television show. Don Reno and Bill Harrell had a television show. So they were reaching large audiences, much larger audiences than in some of the other parts of the country. And then probably in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a radio station, a public radio station out of American University in Washington, D.C. It was WAMU. And Dick Spotswood and a guy named Gary Henderson started a bluegrass show there that became so popular that there were over 40 hours of bluegrass on the air a week at one time. Unfortunately, it's not that way anymore. Well, unfortunately for me, it's turned into more news talk and political commentary, which kind of makes sense in Washington, D.C., but I still hated to see that go off the air.
Yeah. What was your first interaction with the Seldom Scene? Where and when?
Well, I was familiar with them from the early 70s by listening to WAMU, because they being sort of the flagship bluegrass band of the Washington D.C. area at that time period, especially, you couldn't turn on WAMU without hearing a couple of Seldom Scene songs. And then I started a band in the mid 70s called the Johnson Mountain Boys, which were kind of a neo-traditional band. And so promoters started booking us together for events, because I think they thought it was kind of neat that there was a real traditional band, and also at the time, Seldom Scene was considered a very progressive band, not only from the way that they played, but the song selection that they chose. Yeah. There was nobody at Bluegrass doing James Taylor and Eric Clapton tunes back at that time. And they weren't the very first. I would say that Country Gentlemen sort of influenced that song selection, and there was a group called Emerson and Waldron that also did a lot of If I Were a Carpenter and songs like that. Yeah. But the Seldom Scene really put it on the map. But so anyway, I digress. So the promoters would put us together, and then we would always sing a little bit at the end of the shows. As a little. I don't know what you'd call it, just a jam kind of. And we got to be very good friends with those guys over the years, because we did work a lot with them. Yeah. But I never thought back in the 80s when this was happening that I would ever actually end up in the band.
Yeah. When John Duffey passed, what did the bluegrass world lose?
Well, they lost a great personality. You were talking about like Jimmy Martin and Ralph Stanley. These guys were icons. Well, John was too. John was probably one of the most influential and important figures in the modern bluegrass world. But he loved traditional bluegrass too. But he really made his mark by stretching the boundaries of the music, and he was highly respected by audiences and fellow musicians as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I wanted to mention too that you had a pretty long friendship with Hazel Dickens over the years, and she just she got inducted, I think it was last year, into the IBMA Hall of Fame.
She did.
What do you remember most about her, and what was her ultimate impact on not only music but also American culture?
Well, I'll tell you, Hazel was a character among characters, and I became familiar with her music early on in the probably the early '70s. She was partnered with a woman named Alice Gerard, and Hazel and Alice had a huge impact, not only on you know what, I tell you, I'm gonna back up a little bit. I think one of Hazel's major contributions is that she really raised the bar on songwriting.
Yeah.
I mean, her songs had social impact. They had impact on the women's movement, and Hazel was a woman singing in what was a male-dominated world at the time. And I think that she had a big hand in sort of changing that attitude that, you know, old girls could play bluegrass too and play it well and write it well.
Yeah. And
I got to be friends with her through our record company, Rounder Records.
Yep.
Both, J&B and Hazel both recorded for Rounder, and we became Hazel's kind of de facto backup band. And then once the J&B dissolved, Hazel was responsible actually for getting me back into the music, because I sort of got burnt out in the late '80s, and decided to get off the road and go back to school. And she called me one day out of the blue, and I hadn't played with her in a long time, for doing a benefit for keeping bluegrass, interestingly enough, trying to keep bluegrass on the air at WAMU. And she asked me if I would do this benefit with her, and I hadn't sung with her in years. And I did, and the next thing you know, I'm back on the road. And I guess eventually it would have probably happened anyway, but she was the catalyst, the early catalyst for me rejoining the circus.
Yeah. Well, you know, someone like yourself who has a love for the traditional bluegrass, but also was involved in the progression of it. Where is bluegrass right now? It seems like every generation we have this argument of what is and what is not, and neo-traditional versus progressive. Do we open the doors? Do we close the doors? You know what I mean?
I don't think we should close any doors on anything. I mean, we were talking about how the rock and rollers don't do interviews and they're unapproachable and things like that. Well, that's because there's so much money involved in that, and there's so many people trying to get to these guys. Bluegrass is comparison to modern country music, or to pop or rock or R&B or anything like that. It's still small. It's a small business. And there are a lot of bands, but it's making a living at it's a whole different ball game. Yeah. So I don't think we can afford to close the doors on any kind of outside influences. I think there's room for it all, and I wouldn't want to go to a bluegrass festival and hear one traditional act after another, nor would I want to go to a festival and hear one jam band after another. Yeah, agreed. So I think the variety is it really adds to it. It adds dynamic to the overall show. That's why I love to see these festivals that book some singer-songwriter acts and duets, and things like that. That just lower the level of the energy level a little bit, so that when the energy level comes back, they can appreciate it all. It doesn't just wander into each other.
Yeah. What surprised you most about a life in music?
I'm sorry, would you say that again?
What has surprised you most about a life in music?
Well, I hate to keep repeating myself and going back, but the friendships, the people that I see maybe once or twice a year, and different parts of the country, and the conversations just seem to pick up right where they left off. Yeah. And there's just that, and again, you utilize the word community. It really does feel like a community.